Welcome to HCC 50 Years in Counting. I'm Todd Duplantis. Houston Community College is celebrating our 50th anniversary in 2021. And we're taking a look back at the college over the years as seen through the eyes of administrators, faculty, and staff, many of who've been here since the beginning and beyond. I'm joined today by Diana Castillo, College Operations Officer at Coleman College. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
You've been here for 42 years.
That is correct. 42 years. No regrets.
No regrets whatsoever. and you started back in 1976, started as an adjunct, as many folks, and then moved into counseling. Tell us when you started about being an adjunct, the classes you taught, the schedule you had.
Certainly. I started as an adjunct teaching English in a federally funded program called Upward Bound. And actually, it was through a contact at Reagan High School where I worked full-time as an English teacher. And Jerry Dean said to me, Diana, there is a program through Houston Community College, and I think you'd make a great English teacher, and perhaps there may be some opportunities for you there.
Now, what was Houston Community College looked upon back then like? I know we were an offshoot of Houston ISD, the school system. What did people look at? Were we a night school? Were people going to classes at night? What was it like back then?
People were going to classes at night, and students like the ones that I worked with were also taking opportunities on weekends to further enrich their studies so that they could eventually progress into college.
So back then we were a true community college, and community colleges weren't looked at the way they are nowadays. They were looked at quite differently back then. Tell us what that was like.
Well, back then perhaps they didn't have all of the respect that they have today.
Right.
However, I believe, my experience in working at various communities within the Houston area is that very much was an opportunity for a lot of students, full-time workers, high school students looking for opportunities, students who perhaps could not enter traditional pathways. That was the opportunity. That was the door for them to begin something.
And you mentioned working at Reagan High School, but you also spent some time at Waltrip and Scarborough. Now, this was before HCC had dedicated buildings.
Exactly.
We sprung out of HISD, so we were mainly using their facilities. Is that correct?
We were using their facilities to the best of our ability. And back then, it was running a one-stop shop, basically. As a counselor, I had to do it all myself, and I wanted to do it all myself. TRIO programs provided me the opportunity for my understanding of the things that I needed to do in order to really connect with the communities that we were serving.
Tell me for folks who may not be aware of, tell me about the TRIO programs, what they are, and how you got your start with them.
Certainly. TRIO programs are federally funded programs that basically back then and even today provided educational opportunities for disadvantaged students, or as we would term them today, underrepresented communities.
So this was more vocational offerings? Is that where it was headed?
It was mostly, it was some vocational tracks, but our emphasis in the Upward Bound program was really to emphasize academics, transfer, get our college students prepared for scholarships, for financial aid, for choosing a college of their choice, be it HCC or any other, TSU, U of H.
Now, I know currently our average student age is around 27 years old. Students working may have had some college in the past, but returning to school. What was the demographic like back then? Was the student around the same age, or was it much different?
No, the student was really more average age, about 32 years old.
A lot older.
A lot older.
Wow.
Yes. And I dealt with many of those students.
And I imagine these were folks who were out there working hard in the job market, trying to keep it together, but realizing they're not going to go much further without a college education.
Exactly, and we were the door that was open to them. And so when I first started working at Waltrip, I worked the 2 to 10 shift. And
2 to 10 at night.
2 to 10 at night.
Because it was true night school,
It was
correct?
true night school, and that's when our community colleges students would come to us looking for opportunities. And I worked very closely with the faculty and staff to make sure that we made all the right connections for students, including providing to many of them who had never had experiences with college student life the opportunity to join student government, to explore career counseling,
Right.
to look at the potentials of transfer, et cetera.
Now, you worked as a counselor and you would advise students on the courses offerings. What was the transfer situation like then? Nowadays, it's seamless transfers, which to me just blows my mind. The kids can come to HCC, their courses transfer directly to where they're going. They stop one day and just go across to the next campus. It was a lot different back then.
It was a lot different back then. Back then, we had some articulation agreements with traditional universities like U of H and Texas A&M, UT, but counselors back then really had to rely on a lot of things in script. We had to work our manual degree plans, match course by course to that particular university, work individually with the student to understand what would transfer, what would not, et cetera.
And you didn't have computers to
And
work
we
with
didn't
back
have
then.
computers that had all of that data, so it was a lot of things done manually.
Did you spend a lot of time, I guess, brushing up on what courses would transfer? I imagine there were certain ones that your students would come in wanting to take, and you probably had a laundry list of them.
We did have a laundry list of those, the core curriculum, but we also had, and the truth of the matter is that at that particular time at Waltrip and at Scarborough, we really did not have the traditional remediation programs, the courses that would lend themselves to really help prepare a student to strengthen their writing skills in English, their reading skills, math,
Right.
preparing them for college algebra, et cetera.
And I imagine there wasn't the level of testing like there is now to help the students, was
No,
there?
there was not the level of testing. There was some testing. There was some career counseling. There was some transfer information, a little bit of everything. So a counselor really had to do their due diligence. I had to study a lot of those things so that they became second nature for me, so that when I would sit with a student, I automatically, in talking to them, would realize what they needed to do and be able to show them the pathway.
I know student success is a big mantra here at HCC.
It is.
And back then, it just seems like it was a lot more difficult for students and for you trying to advise them.
It was, but you know what, Todd? When you do anything with passion, and I think that when you remember that your core mission is students first, anyone that is working in the area of teaching or at student advising is going to do the things that we need to do to help prepare those students.
Absolutely.
And lead them in the right direction. That's what we're here to do, to serve them.
We're going to talk more about your career. We're talking with Diana Castillo, College Operations Officer at Coleman College, and we're going to talk about her transition into the college operations field. We'll have more coming up. HCC 50 Years and Counting is the show. I'm Todd Duplantis. We'll be right back.
I've seen people's lives change just by attending a class at HCC.
Some of them might not have the financial means to go to a four-year university. That doesn't make them any less quote-unquote smart than the kids who go to a four-year school.
HCC is easy to get to. It's easy to apply and easy to become a part of.
It gave me so much confidence.
Once you finish your 2 years there, you can transition into a four-year university or go into the workforce.
It's affordable, it's accessible, it changes lives.
HCC. So many reasons, so little tuition. Register today at hccs.edu/now.
Welcome back to HCC 50 Years and Counting, and I'm Todd Duplantis, and we're talking about Houston Community College as we celebrate our 50th anniversary in 2021. We're joined by faculty and staff still with us, administration now, still with us, who've been here for many decades. Diana Castillo, College Operations Officer at Coleman College, I've been speaking with you, and Dr. Norma Perez, the HCC Vice Chancellor of Instructional Services and Chief Academic Officer. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I was speaking a bit with Diana about the camaraderie that you guys have developed over the years. She said she has pictures from you over the years. Back in the 70s and early 80s, there obviously had to be some type of camaraderie that kept everyone together because you guys have been here for decades.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me a bit about that.
Well, I think back in those days when we first started at HCC, I know that Diana Castillo was here before I was here, and she was a counselor. And so since I started my role as a counselor manager, I had an opportunity to cross paths with her. And at that point, there were a limited number of Hispanics that worked for HCC. So I think that in itself drew a lot of us together in terms of making sure that we were meeting the needs of our community. Because I think all of us, at least I became a part of HCC because I wanted to make a difference in our minority communities. And I felt that HCC was the right pathway for our minority students to start their higher education.
HCC now is more or less the face of our community. We have more international students than any other college around the country. What was the college? Was the college very much like that back then? Was it thought of like that back then in the 70s and 80s?
I don't think it was thought of as diversified as it is now, but we did acknowledge and recognized still a pretty good sizable potential pool of international students that were seeking career opportunities from other countries, et cetera.
Now, we talked about your career, and Diana, I wanted to talk about how you transitioned into college operations, because you're now with Coleman College, and you've been with other colleges before in that same role. How was it making that step? And I know we're going to talk with Dr. Perez about her early career, but both of y'all were involved in the counseling field, and you've moved on to administration. How did that prepare you for the role you have now as college operations officer at Coleman College?
Well, I think that, like many of us, we are passionate about what we do. We want to help students. We're always looking for stretch assignments. I know I was looking for stretch assignments. That's really how I volunteered to be the writer of the Counseling Corner, and did that for a couple of years because I recognized that there was a void for students. There were a lot of things that students needed to know, and reaching out to them through the newspaper was one way of doing it.
Now, these were publications that were in the Egalitarian back when they had a physical version of the Egalitarian. It was a newspaper back then.
It was a newspaper,
Now it's online.
hard copy.
Right.
And that was one way of reaching the student population and letting them know things tips for success, how to prepare for midterms and finals, teaching them about the TASK program, Texas Academic Skills Program, et cetera.
And Dr. Perez, I want to ask you a similar question. You were involved in the counseling field. How did that prepare you? You've come a long way now as the Vice Chancellor of Instructional Services. How did that early role prepare you for where you are now?
Well, I served as a counseling officer. And at that time, the counseling officer oversaw all of the student services related to advising and counseling for the whole district. So that was my first district opportunity or job to be able to see how we were serving our students at our various college locations, which at that time we had a number of locations we were using the high schools. And so that, and being a counselor, one of the things you learn as a counselor is the listening skills. And so as a supervisor, if you're going to be a good supervisor, you've got to learn to listen to your folks. And so I think that in itself, and then of course you take care of your folks. And so I think that being a counselor gave me those skills to be able to continue to move up in administration and always wanting to make a difference, because I have been in various positions here at HCC, because every time I felt I had finished something or maybe there was a change in the institution, I felt that I was prepared to move on to whatever that next task was.
A new challenge.
Yes.
I talked with Diana earlier about this, but we were discussing the fact that when she started, and I know when you were first started, HCC was across the district in high schools, strip centers, in different areas. You didn't have dedicated buildings yet. What was that like for you? How challenging was that?
Well, when I first started, I actually worked at 3 locations. My main office was at 22 Wall Drive, which at that point was the centralized administrative office. Then I worked at Barbara Jordan High School in the evening after 2. And then I also worked at Milby High School. That was the evening program at that particular high school again after 2 o'clock. So I had 3 sites where I had to report to every day, and it was a little challenging. Part of it because there was still having to work with the high schools and trying to figure out what classrooms we had, what kind of services could we take advantage of. So those were the challenges that we encountered back in those days. But the population was very similar in terms of, and the high schools that I worked in, Barbara Jordan at that point was predominantly black, and Milby was predominantly Hispanic. And so that was my exposure to that community at that point, and I enjoyed working with those 2 groups, and I knew that at that point, I mean, that solidified for me the fact that I wanted to continue to work with HCC.
Back then, when HCC was an offshoot of HISD, when we first started out, how was it working in the high schools? Was there more collaboration with the HISD administrators at that time, because you're in the same buildings? Did you find that more useful at the time?
I think we found it useful. My experience, at least at Waltrip and at Scarborough, the administration, the HISD administration was right there around the corner from our offices. So in order to start those dual credit opportunities for students, we simply made our appointment, went in and spoke to the counselor, to the high school principal, did whatever we had to do to create those dual credit opportunities for high school students.
And dual credit was it in its infancy at that point?
It was
wasn't-
in its infancy.
Very much so.
And it's come so far. How was it working with the dual credit program back then? Did you find many high schools very receptive to wanting to start this, Dr. Perez?
No, I don't think we did. There were very few high schools that were interested in wanting to do that.
Why is that?
I think part of it was they were not that familiar with it. It was still a new initiative, and so, and part of it was funding. Right now, the dual credit programs that we offer is free to the students who are in district or in our service area. Back in those days, they had to pay for that, and so, in some of our communities, our students couldn't afford that, so they were not taking advantage of dual
So the
credit.
students were having to pay for it back then. It was a much more of a burden for them. Now it's offered for free, for at least for Houston ISD students, and but back then it was totally different. Sounds
It was
like.
totally different, and at Waltrip and Scarborough, even though back then those particular communities were thought of as more middle income, they really weren't. They were already beginning to change in terms of the demographic makeup of the high schools. You might see maybe 3 courses being taught per term at each of those schools in terms of dual credit.
Right.
Now there's a lot more opportunity.
Yeah, you asked the question about, what was the difference between being in the high schools and not being in the high schools. I think one of the advantages which Diana talked about is the fact that, yes, we had better access to the high school students than what we do now, that we're in separate facilities. But the other thing that we did have issues with were the logistics. There were some problems with some high school teachers did not want us to erase their blackboards, and so
I was
then,
going to
of
ask
course-
about that. You're
and then,
using
of
somebody
course-
else's classroom. That's
right,
their territory.
Exactly. And so we had to sort of work through that in terms of what we could use and what they couldn't use, and having to train our faculty in terms of what they could touch and what they couldn't touch with the specific classrooms that we were sharing. So those kinds of issues were very real and sometimes difficult to work through.
And as counselors, we were the ones that we
Having
would
to
have to work
smooth
with
the ways.
Cheryl Peters, Barry Burns, Dale Konachek, all of those faculty to relay those messages so that we kept peace.
Diana Castillo, thanks for joining us on the show today. The show is called HCC 50 Years and Counting. We're going to be back with Dr. Norma Perez and continue the conversation. Stay tuned.
We have academic programs that help students get from high school into a university. And the data is very clear that students that take the path of a community college finish in far higher numbers than students that start straight into a university experience. Our students can achieve a baccalaureate degree in multiple fields from the universities in the area without ever leaving Houston Community College.
Welcome back to HCC, 50 years in counting. I'm Todd Duplantis, joined by Dr. Norma Perez, HCC Vice Chancellor of Instructional Services and Chief Academic Officer. Welcome once again to the show.
Thank you, Todd.
We were talking earlier with Diana Castillo here, and we were talking about your starting here as a counselor, manager, and eventually Chief Counseling Officer. Counselors back then were different than they are now, because counselors are really advisors now, and counselors are something totally different. Talk about the two now and what they're considered as opposed to where they were then.
Well, counselors back in the early 70s were actually advisors. They were actually academic advisors. Most of them were trained basically to advise students in education. We did have some counselors that were, and they were very limited, that were into mental health. And in fact, Becky Howry is one of those who is, I believe, still with us to this day. So she was actually our one and only mental health counselor in the whole district back in those days.
Wow, I know Becky, and she's still here today.
Yes.
And so it's a different field. It's really keeping the advisors, helping the students to pick out the right courses and keep them on the path to get to their next step if they're going to another college.
And so now today we have advisors that do what the counselors were doing back in those days. And now our counselors are the ones that really deal with any kind of emotional issues. They deal with our disability students in reference to determining what those accommodations should be. So it's more specialized counseling, and in fact, I believe that all of them are licensed professional counselors.
I want to talk about the relationship with universities back then, because now we have seamless partnerships so students can come to HCC and get a 4-year degree through UT Tyler or UHD or other, and then we have seamless transfers to other universities. Right. Back then, though, there was a lot of competition. Maybe you could talk about that.
Well, there was some competition, but actually, the program that I started under as counselor manager was what we call the Minority Transfer Opportunity Program. Mm-hmm. So my job was basically to begin to develop those partnerships with the various universities within our area and try to expose our students to that transition. What does it take to get your Associate of Arts or Associate of Science at HCC, and then make that transfer, and trying to make that transfer easier for them by having those relationships with University of Houston, with the Prairie View A&M, and even UT. And so I did work with taking our students on a field trip, exposing them to those institutions, all through the grant that HCC had funded.
What was the relationship? What was it like originally working with those institutions? Were they resistant at first? And now, obviously, they welcome us with open arms because we transfer a lot of students. But what was it like then?
Well, actually, I did not have any problems. I think that's probably the start of beginning to look at the fact that higher education needed to be more diverse. And so Houston Community College had a diverse student population, even in those days. And so I think that they saw this as an opportunity. I worked very closely with U of H. We actually created a video of trying to make that transfer process very easy for students to understand. And we did it using a mime. And so, that was I think, very creative, and yet U of H was willing to work with me in developing that video.
Now the focus is to have these seamless transfers where students don't lose hours. I remember when I went to college, I probably lost a semester or two with hours I really didn't need, taking courses that didn't transfer anywhere. But we really work hard for that now. What was it like back then? Diana Castillo was telling me earlier that she had to really do some studying to find out what courses fit in the matrix to go somewhere else.
Right. If you were really a good counselor, you did your homework. And by doing your homework, it meant you had to research what universities required of our students who transferred to those institutions. Keep in mind that we didn't have the technology back then that we have today. And so that made it harder for us to really begin to develop like degree plans. The degree plans we had were basically all on paper. And so your job was to give the student a degree plan. The student had to maintain it. You maintain a copy. And as you know, at HCC, our students don't attend the SIM campus. So here we are trying to locate that degree plan that student initially found if they lost it. So, it's trying to track down who's the counselor that created it. So it was quite difficult to try to keep tabs on where our students were academically with their degree plans, and then which one of those wanted to transfer and what institution did they want to transfer to. Because again, all the rules were different based on the university you wanted to attend in terms of the courses you needed that would transfer and would not require that you take additional courses.
When HCC started getting more dedicated buildings in college campuses, when we changed into the 6 different colleges, did that make your job a lot easier as functioning within the college?
Well, actually, when we divided into our 6 colleges back in early 90s, it actually eliminated the counseling officer position. And so I was then assigned to become the associate dean of enrollment services for the Northeast College. So I actually worked out of the Northline Mall at that point. We still
Right.
had a mall, which no longer exists, but that's where my office was. And I oversaw financial aid, enrollment services, career services, testing, all those things that are important in terms of support services for our students.
And what was the year back then when this was all happening, roughly?
I believe it was either 1991 or 1992.
But today, looking at where HCC is today, did you foresee it as being as large as we are and as offering everything that we do? I know when I've talked to a lot of folks, they said, community colleges were looked at as vocational schools. They weren't looked at that. But now community colleges are really the smart option in many ways for many kids and many folks to get that college degree or get the education.
But HCC was started by with the notion that it was going to be more of a workforce school. It started because you had some of the administrators from Houston Independent School District that wanted to see more workforce development. And so they wanted to see more of that vocational education being done at the community college. So the focus initially, I know when I first started under Mr. Whiteley, that was his focus. That was his area of expertise. And then slowly we began to develop as an academic school. And I think that, a lot of people didn't see us as that. I mean, even the universities didn't see us as an academic institution. They saw us more as workforce. And I think through the years, we've proven that our students who do take academic courses were just as prepared or better prepared than students who go directly into a university.
If you could change something that happened over the last time you were here, what would that have been? If you could go back and give yourself some advice back when you were first starting, what would you have told yourself?
Well, I think that, as I indicated to you initially, I came to HCC with the desire to make a difference. I'm a product of the Houston Independent School District. I was born and raised in Houston. I've seen this city grow, and I've seen the challenges that minorities have had in this city and in our educational system. And so because of that, I wanted to come to HCC to make that difference. So once I saw HCC, I saw the potential, then I stayed. And I'm still here today because I still see that there's potential for us. There's things that we can still do as an institution to serve our community, whether it be in the academic area, whether it be in the workforce area. But I think that it's an ideal location, it's an ideal institution to be able to allow students an opportunity to fulfill their dreams.
Dr. Norma Perez, great note to end on. We appreciate you being here on the show. HCC 50 Years and Counting, I'm Todd Duplantis. We'll see you next time.